Part 1, The Last Quiet Night. The security footage timestamp reads 9:04 p.m. In the upper left corner of the frame, the image is grainy, the lighting amber and uneven, the way all restaurant cameras look when nobody expects them to matter. Three men are on the floor. One is curled near the base of a table, his hands pressed to his ribs. One is flat on his back, blinking at the ceiling, like he's not entirely sure what country he's in. The third is slumped sideways against a booth bench, his nose bent at an angle it was not born with. 41 people sit in frozen positions throughout the dining room, forks raised halfway to mouths, wine glasses suspended. A child has both hands pressed against her cheeks. A man in a gray sweater has pushed his chair back but hasn't stood. Conversations stop mid-sentence, and the silence that replaced them is the kind you feel in your chest. In the center of the frame, a young woman stands alone. She is not tall. She cannot be more than 5'3" in heels. She is wearing a dark green dress, and her dark hair is pulled back from her face, and her posture is the kind of straight that doesn't come from ballet or good parenting. She is looking around the room with gray eyes that are calm in a way that has nothing to do with shock. She is not shaking. She is not breathing hard. She looks, if anything, mildly inconvenienced. She reaches into her purse and removes a folded bill, places it on the table, smooths it once with 2 fingers. Then she straightens her sleeve and adjusts the strap of her purse and looks around as though she has just returned from the restroom and is trying to remember where she left her coat. Nobody in that restaurant knew her name that night. By the following morning, 18 million people would, and almost none of them would believe what they were seeing. Here is what the footage does not show. It does not show the 12 years. It does not show a little girl 12 years old standing in a government office in Fort Lewis, Washington, holding a folded flag and trying to understand why the weight of it felt nothing like what she had imagined. It does not show the man who taught her everything she knew, or the promise she made to him, or the decade and more she spent keeping it. It does not show the morning of this particular day when she woke up at 5:15 without an alarm the way she always did, and lay in the dark of a hotel room in Portland and thought about a dinner reservation she had made 6 weeks in advance. A booth at a restaurant her father had once described to her from memory. A place he had never taken her. A night she had planned to spend alone, saying goodbye to someone who had been gone for 12 years and who she still in the quietest hours expected to hear come through a door. But to understand what happened at Harlow and Reed on the night of October 14th, you have to go back further than the footage. You have to go back to a man named Ray Voss. Master Sergeant Raymond Voss served for 19 years. He was not a large man in the way that made people nervous on sight. He was 5'11", lean through the shoulders, with hands that looked ordinary until you saw what they could do. He had the kind of face that revealed nothing unless he decided it should, and he had the patience of someone who understood that most problems, given enough time and stillness, solved themselves. He was, by every account of the men who served alongside him, exceptional in the way that is hardest to explain because it had nothing to do with loudness or spectacle and everything to do with precision. He was assigned to a Special Forces unit out of Fort Bragg by the time Delia was born. He was home when he could be. He was gone when the mission required it. His wife, Vivian, understood this in the way that military spouses develop a separate category for understanding, one that sits apart from ordinary acceptance that has a texture closer to faith. Delia was 8 years old the first time her father taught her how to read a room. They were in a diner outside of Fayetteville, North Carolina. Booths with cracked red vinyl, a jukebox in the corner that nobody was using. Ray Voss set down his coffee cup and said quietly, without looking at her directly, "Tell me who just walked in the door." She told him. A man, maybe 40, wearing work boots with dried mud on the right sole and clean on the left, carrying his keys in his left hand, which meant he had parked close or was in a hurry or both. He sat with his back to the wall. Ray Voss nodded once. Not praise exactly. Confirmation. He taught her the same way over the years that followed. Not as training, not in any formal sense, nothing that resembled a program or a curriculum. It was closer to conversation. The way a craftsman passes knowledge to the next generation, not through lecture, but through presence, through doing things together so many times that the knowledge becomes indistinguishable from instinct. By the time Delia was 12, she could field strip a rifle in the dark, identify 12 pressure points on the human body that produced specific and immediate results, apply a tourniquet correctly in under 40 seconds, and move through a space in a way that made her functionally invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically trained to look. She did not think of any of this as unusual. It was simply the language she and her father shared. He was deployed for the last time in October, 12 years ago. The nature of the mission was classified. The location was not disclosed in any official communication. Vivian Voss had learned long ago not to ask questions that would not be answered, and so she packed his bag with the same quiet efficiency she always had, and Delia walked him to the car, and Ray Voss crouched down to her eye level in the driveway and held both her hands in his. He said, "I taught you those things so you'd be safe, not so you'd be dangerous. There's a difference. Do you understand it?" She said she did. He said, "Promise me something. Promise me you don't use what I taught you unless there is no other way, unless someone will die if you don't. You are not a weapon. You are my daughter. Act like it," she promised him. 3 weeks later, two men in uniform appeared at the front door. The flag they carried was folded with the same precision as every other flag delivered to every other family in the same way. It did not weigh what Delia expected. She held it in both arms and stood in the doorway while her mother's hand pressed against her shoulder, and she understood in a way that bypassed language entirely that the world had just divided itself into before and after. She kept the promise. For 12 years she kept it. She studied, finished school, took a civilian position with a government contractor that did not require her to explain the full extent of what her father had taught her. She paid her rent. She called her mother on Sunday evenings. She stayed out of situations that might have required her to be the person her father had made her capable of being. She kept the promise, and she did not break it, not once through 12 years of a life that was quieter than anyone watching from the outside might have expected, but that she understood to be the particular shape of the thing she owed him. On October 14th, 12 years after the flag, she drove to Fort Lewis in the morning and stood in front of the memorial wall and found his name with her fingertips. She stood there for a long time, long enough for the light to shift, long enough for two other visitors to come and go without speaking to her. Then she drove back to Portland, changed into the dark green dress she had brought specifically for this occasion, and went to dinner. Harlow and Reed occupies a renovated brick building on Northwest 13th Avenue in Portland's Pearl District. The interior is warm without being precious about it. Dark wood amber lighting the kind of acoustic design that absorbs conversation without eliminating it entirely. The wine list is extensive and seriously priced. The steaks are dry-aged in-house. It is the kind of place where the service is excellent, partly because the staff is well compensated, and partly because the clientele, by the time they arrive, have already decided the evening is going to be good. Delia Voss arrived at 8:47 in the evening. She was shown to booth 11, a corner seat in the rear section of the dining room, curved like a half moon with clear sight lines to both the main entrance and the side hallway that led to the kitchen. She had requested this specific booth when she made the reservation. The host, who did not know why, noted only that she thanked him without looking at the table first, which struck him later as the kind of detail that only seems significant in retrospect. She sat with her back to the wall. Old habit, non-negotiable. 2 menus were on the table, 2 glasses of water. She had asked for this when she made the reservation 6 weeks ago, and the host had written it down without comment. She could not have explained it to anyone in a way that would have made sense. It was simply the dinner she and her father had promised each other, and she intended to have it with him in the only way that was still possible. The second menu would go unread. That was fine. He had always been a patient man. She set her purse on the bench beside her at the 2 o'clock position. Her left heel lifted slightly from the floor and hovered there a fraction of an inch, not enough for anyone watching to notice. She used the curve of her water glass to check the reflection of the room behind her without appearing to look. 41 diners, a family of 4 near the window, children, under 10 early bedtime crowd. 2 business meetings happening simultaneously, separated by 3 tables, neither party aware of the other. 6 couples, approximate age range 30 to 70. A table of women celebrating something the nature of which was unclear from body language alone, though the volume suggested it was going well. A man dining alone near the bar, reading something on his phone, wedding ring, occasional checking of the watch. And 1 table over in the adjacent booth, a man in a plaid shirt eating a steak with the methodical attention of someone for whom the meal was the entire point of the evening. He was somewhere in his 50s, gray at the temples, a wedding ring that had been on long enough to leave a permanent impression on the finger. He ate without looking at his phone. He did not appear to be waiting for anyone. He was simply eating, and there was something in the quality of his stillness that Delia noticed and filed without thinking about it directly. She poured a glass of wine and held it with 2 fingers. Not because she had learned to hold it that way, but because her father had once mentioned completely without ceremony that a glass held that way was easier to set down quickly if you needed both hands. She was thinking about a dinner she would never have, a conversation she had run through in various forms for 12 years. The things she would have told him, the things she would have asked, Whether he would have been proud of the life she had built in the absence of the life they had planned, or whether proud was even the right word, whether it was something quieter than that, something more like recognition. She did not notice the three men come in until they were already past the host stand. She noticed them then. She noticed them the way she noticed everything, which was to say, she processed them before she consciously decided to look. The shift in the ambient noise of the room slightly louder in a specific direction. The quality of the movement less a group of people navigating a space, and more a group of people assuming the space would accommodate them. Three men, late 30s to early 40s, the particular looseness of movement that comes after several hours of sustained drinking. Their voices arrived before their faces did. The one in front was large, 6'3" at minimum, built through the shoulders in a way that had been maintained but was beginning to soften. He was wearing a sport coat that fit well and an expression that had settled into the comfortable assumption that rooms generally arrange themselves around him. His name was Brett Colton. She did not know that yet. Behind him came two others. The shorter one on his right moved with the quick, off-balance energy of someone whose nervous system was running slightly ahead of his judgment. The one on his left was broader, slower. The kind of slow that was not lack of speed, but deliberate positioning, the patience of someone who preferred to let a situation develop before committing to a direction. The host moved to intercept them toward a table at the back. The large man did not follow. His eyes moved across the room in the practiced scan of someone accustomed to entering spaces and assessing them for advantage. It was, Delia noted, a version of exactly what she had done when she arrived. The difference was the thing he was looking for. His gaze stopped at booth 11. She saw his eyes move across the two menus, the second water glass, the empty seat across from her. She saw something register in his face. Not calculation exactly. Something more reflexive than that and more familiar. She had seen it before in other contexts, on other faces, the moment when a person identifies something they believe is available to them. He said something to the two men behind him. She could not hear the words from where she sat, but she read them in the geometry of his chin, the direction of the tilt, the way his companion's eyes followed the line he indicated. She set her wineglass down. The host said something. Brett Colton did not appear to hear it. He walked toward booth 11 with the men behind him, and the ambient noise of the dining room continued, and the jazz from the corner speakers played something unhurried and nobody else had noticed yet, and Delia Voss breathed in slowly and began running through options. Public space. 41 civilians, including children. Two clear exits, neither of them clear in the sense of being empty. No elevated position, no cover that would not also block egress. Rules are different here. They are always different here. Start with words. Always start with words. She looked up when they reached the table. The large man spread his hands in a gesture of mock warmth, the performance of a person who had done this enough times to have developed a version of it they found convincing. He said, "Well, look at this, all dressed up and sitting alone." She held his gaze. Neutral, measuring. She said, "Good evening. I'm just finishing dinner. I'm sure they can find you a wonderful table." He laughed, which was not quite a laugh, more the sound of someone demonstrating to the people around them that they are not taking the situation seriously. He slid into the booth across from her. His two companions took positions at either end of the table. Not sitting, standing, not casual. She noted the positions, she noted the angles, and then she noticed something else. The sport coat. The left lapel inside edge, a small embroidered logo she recognized, not because she had seen it recently, but because she had seen it in a document 12 years old folded inside a field notes journal she had carried in the lining of her bag for a decade without fully understanding why she kept it. Two intersecting lines, the initials CDG, rendered in a font that was trying to be military without having earned the right to be. Colton Defense Group. This was the first twist, and she absorbed it the way her father had taught her to absorb unexpected information in the field without changing her face, without changing her breathing, letting it settle into the back of the mind where it could be used rather than reacted to. She kept her face exactly where it was. She did not allow a single thing to move. Her father had written that name in his field notes. He had written it twice in the particular way he wrote things he wanted to come back to underlined, once a small asterisk in the margin. She said, "I appreciate the offer, but I prefer to eat alone. I'll pay my check and leave you the table." The man across from her leaned back with the expression of someone who had just watched the rules of a game they were confident in begin to shift slightly, not enough to change the outcome, but enough to require a minor adjustment. He said, "See, I don't think that's what you want. I think you've been sitting here waiting for somebody who isn't coming, and I think we've just done you a favor." She reached for her purse. Standard posture, Deliberate, she said, "The bill will cover whatever you'd like to order. Have a good evening." His hand came across the table. It was fast, she gave him that. Faster than she expected from someone that size with that much alcohol in his system. His fingers closed around her wrist, and the grip was not a holding grip. It was a demonstrating grip, knuckles white with the pressure of making a point. He said, "You're not going anywhere until we say you can go." 41 people in the room, the family near the window, the business meetings, the couples, the man eating steak in the adjacent booth. She did not look at her wrist. She looked at his face, and she began counting her breathing, 4 counts in hold, 8 counts out. And she thought very clearly, this is still not the moment. This is still not it. The man in the plaid shirt at the adjacent booth set down his fork. She noticed that too. He stood up. He was not a large man. He was not young. He was the kind of man who had spent his life building something in ordinary increments, work and family, in years the accumulation of a life lived without particular spectacle. He stood up anyway. He said, "Let her go, before this gets worse for you." Brett Colton turned his head slowly. The expression on his face was the particular contempt of a person who has never had to take the courage of someone they underestimate seriously. He said, "Sit down, old man." The man in the plaid shirt did not sit down. Seth Pryor moved first. Not a full strike, something between a shove and a punch calibrated to humiliate rather than injure, the kind of motion designed to communicate hierarchy without leaving marks. It caught the older man in the shoulder and sent him back hard into his chair. A wine glass tipped and caught the edge of the table and shattered on the floor. A child 2 tables over gasped and then went silent. Somewhere behind them, someone stood up instinctively and then didn't know what to do next. Delia looked at the man in the plaid shirt. He was already trying to stand up again. He had a wedding ring. He had gray at his temples. He had the specific, unhurried quality of someone who had thought about what kind of person he wanted to be in exactly this situation and had arrived at an answer he was going to act on, even though his hands were probably shaking, even though everything in him must have been broadcasting that this was not his fight and not his problem, and that the most rational thing he could do was stay in his chair. He stood up anyway, and Delia Voss, in the particular silence of her own chest, understood that the promise she had kept for 12 years was about to be tested by something her father had never specifically addressed, because her father was a precise man, not a man who left loopholes, and what he had said was, "You don't use what I taught you unless there is no other way, unless someone will die if you don't." He had said that. And the man in the plaid shirt with the gray at his temples was going to get badly hurt, possibly worse, and there were children in this room, and she knew with the specific clarity of someone trained to assess situations rather than feel their way through them that the 3 men at her table were not going to stop at a warning. She thought, "Dad, I'm sorry. I think this is the moment you were talking about." She thought, "I hope I do it the way you taught me." Her chair slid back without sound. The hand on her wrist registered her movement as resistance and tightened automatically, which was exactly what she expected. And she let it because the tightening changed the angle, and the changed angle meant that when she brought her free hand down across the inside of his wrist in a single clean motion, his fingers opened before his brain had processed the signal to close them. He made a sound she had not heard an adult make since childhood. Seth Pryor turned toward her. She moved toward him while he was still turning. Her elbow caught him in the sternum at the precise point where the impact would fold him rather than stagger him, and he went down with a sound like a large bag of sand dropped on tile, and he stayed there. Danny Fitch came from her left arms and out the instinctive grappling motion of someone who had learned to fight by doing it rather than by being taught. She stepped inside the reach, which is always the move, has always been the move, because outside the reach is where the force is, and inside the reach is where the person is, and persons, unlike force, can be redirected. She redirected him. The floor redirected him further. A dinner roll from the passing cart caught the edge of her elbow and bounced off his forehead on the way down and rolled under the salad station. And under other circumstances, this would have been funny. And later when people described the night, several of them would describe it as funny because there was something about the precision of the chaos that was difficult to process as entirely serious. Brett Colton stood up. He roared the way people roar when what they are actually feeling is confusion, and the roar is the only language they have for it. He came across the space between them at full weight, which was a lot of weight, and she let him come because his momentum was his, and she only needed to borrow it briefly. She pivoted. She took his arm. She introduced him to the corner of the table with enough authority that the sound was audible across most of the dining room, And then he sat down against the bench in the particular way that suggests the decision to sit was not entirely voluntary. 17 seconds. The room did not make a sound. She straightened her sleeve. She looked around at 41 people who were looking at her with expressions that ranged from paralysis to what could only be described as reverence, and she thought very clearly, okay, that's done. Now what? She reached into her purse. She removed a folded bill. She placed it on the table. She said, I apologize for the disturbance. These gentlemen appear to be having some kind of episode. And then the front door of Harlow and Reed opened, and a man walked in carrying a takeout bag in one hand and his off-duty weapon on his hip and 22 years of reading rooms behind his eyes. And Detective Cal Rourke stopped 3 steps inside the entrance and looked at 3 men on the floor and a young woman in a dark green dress who was straightening her purse, her strap, and he took in all of it in approximately 4 seconds, and then he reached into his jacket pocket for his badge. Part 2, What the Dark Remembers. Cal Rourke had been a detective for 22 years, and in that time he had developed what his wife called the look, which was not a single expression so much as a complete reorganization of his face that happened in the first 4 seconds after he walked into a situation he needed to understand. He did it now. 3 men on the floor, one trying to remember how to breathe, one examining the ceiling with the focused attention of someone who has recently discovered it is very interesting. The third sitting against the booth bench with his nose rearranged and his eyes at slightly different heights, which was the kind of asymmetry that took months to correct and sometimes didn't. The restaurant around them was suspended in the particular silence that follows something that happened too fast for the brain to narrate in real time. And in the middle of it, a young woman in a dark green dress, 5'3", 115 pounds, if he was being generous, who was smoothing the strap of her purse over her shoulder with the calm of someone who had just finished a phone call they had been expecting. His wife touched his arm from behind. She said his name quietly, the version of it she used when she wanted him to remember he was off duty. He was already moving. He crossed the dining room with his badge in his hand and his takeout bag still in the other, because setting it down would have required a decision about where to put it, and that was not the highest priority right now. He stopped 6 feet from the woman in the green dress. He held up the badge and said, Detective Rourke, can you tell me what happened here? She looked at the badge the way people look at things they have already assessed before they appear to be looking at them. Then she looked at him. Her eyes were gray and remarkably level, and she said, they approached the table uninvited. I attempted to leave. They prevented me. The situation required a response. He waited for more. Nothing came. He said, are you injured? She said, no. He said, can I get your name? She reached into her purse without hurrying and produced her driver's license and handed it to him with 2 fingers. He read it. Delia Voss, Portland address, 24 years old. He looked at the picture and looked at her and looked at the 3 men on the floor again, and somewhere in the back of his mind, something was already pulling at him. Some thread he could not immediately identify because 22 years of this kind of work had made him fluent in a language that was mostly instinct and only secondarily explainable. He said, I'll need you to stay while I sort this out. She said, I understand. He went to the men first. Danny Fitch was sitting up now, blinking. Seth Pryor was on his side, doing the careful breathing of someone whose sternum had been introduced to something unforgiving and was still negotiating the experience. Brett Colton had not moved from his position against the bench, but his eyes were tracking, which meant the concussion, if there was one, was mild. Rourke crouched beside Brett Colton and checked his pulse at the neck, which was fine strong, the pulse of someone who was going to be angry rather than injured when the next few minutes passed. Then he took Brett's left hand to check the wrist. He saw the tattoo. It was small, 3 centimeters across, maybe less, placed on the inside of the wrist where a watch band would cover it. The design was simple to the point of looking accidental, 2 small marks arranged in a specific relationship to each other, the kind of thing that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. Cal Rourke was specifically looking for it. He had been looking for it for 4 months since the 3rd complaint came in from a woman in the Hawthorne district who described a man with a mark on his wrist exactly like this one, and who had declined to file a formal report because the 2 previous women who had described the same mark had been made to feel through mechanisms Rourke was still working to document that filing a formal report would be more costly to them than not filing one. He had a photograph of the mark in a folder on his desk. He had 3 statements he could not yet use in a courtroom. He had the name Colton in his notes circled with no last name, attached a thread he had not yet pulled far enough to see where it led. He stood up slowly. He did not look at Delia Voss yet. He said to the nearest restaurant staff member, call 911 for medical. Tell them non-life-threatening possible concussion and rib contusion. And I need to ask everyone to please stay in the restaurant for the next several minutes. He was aware of the phones. He had been aware of them since he walked in. The dining room was full of small rectangles of light pointed in his general direction. And he understood with the resignation of someone who had spent the last decade watching evidence simultaneously document and contaminate itself that whatever had happened here was already on its way to being somewhere else. He walked back to Delia Voss. She had not moved to sit back down. She was standing with her weight distributed evenly and her purse settled against her hip, and she was watching the room in a specific way that he recognized and that had nothing to do with the anxious scanning of someone who had just been through a frightening experience. She was cataloging. She was tracking entrances and bodies and potential complications the way a person tracks weather automatically without apparent effort. He said, "Miss Voss, I need to take a formal statement. I know that's not what you want to do right now, but I'm going to need you to walk me through the sequence of events." She said, "Of course." He took out his notebook, old habit. He knew officers half his age who use their phones for everything, and he understood the efficiency argument, but there was something about writing things by hand that still worked differently in him, still slowed the intake to a pace where he could also be listening in the way he needed to listen. He said, "Start from when they came in." She started from when they came in. She spoke in sequence. Not the sequence of someone recounting something frightening, not the halting, out-of-order reconstruction of a witness processing trauma. She described positions, angles, the placement of the three men relative to the table, the specific grip on her wrist which she described with a precision that identified the type of hold and its probable intent. She described her verbal attempts to de-escalate. She described the moment the man in the adjacent booth stood up and the subsequent physical contact that caused him to fall, and she described her decision to act in the sequence of actions she took. It took 4.5 minutes. Cal Rourke had been writing the whole time. When she finished, he looked at what he had written, and then he looked at her. Witnesses told stories. They overlapped details and skipped things and came back to them. They described feelings more readily than positions. They said things like, "I'm not sure exactly when, and it happened so fast, and I was scared." This was not what Delia Voss had just given him. What she had given him was a report. He said, "You described the grip on your wrist as a type 2 restraint hold. Where did you learn that terminology?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "My father was in the military. He taught me some things." He said, "Your father?" She said, "Yes." He said, "What branch?" She said, "Army Special Forces." He wrote that down. Then he excused himself and walked to the far end of the room where his wife was sitting at the bar with her coat still on, watching him with the expression she had developed over 22 years of being married to his job. He handed her the takeout bag and told her this was going to be a while. She took it without a word. She had done this before. He pulled out his phone and searched the name. Delia Voss, Portland, 24 years old. There was nothing. Not the standard absence of a criminal record or a minimal social footprint. Nothing. No social media accounts. No news mentions. No professional listings. No photographs attached to her name anywhere he could find in 3 minutes of looking. She was 24 years old in the digital era, and she was functionally invisible. And that did not happen by accident. That happened by discipline, and discipline of that kind, maintained for that long, required a reason. He searched the address on her license. The apartment was registered to a holding company. He wrote the company name in his notebook and put a circle around it. Then he searched Ray Voss, Army Special Forces. 3 results: a memorial listing on the Fort Lewis Wall of Honor, a brief notice in a military publication from 12 years ago, a congressional record reference he could not access without credentials he would need to request. He went back to her table. She was still standing. She had not, in his absence, sat down or moved to leave or taken out her phone. She was watching the room. He sat down across from her. He set his notebook on the table and said, "Miss Voss, I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand it's not an accusation. It's a question I'd ask anyone in this situation." She said, "All right." He said, "The 3 men you incapacitated, do you know them?" She said, "No." He said, "Have you seen any of them before tonight?" She paused. 1 beat 2, not hesitation, but precision, the pause of someone who was being accurate rather than quick. She said, "I recognize the logo on his jacket, the man who grabbed my wrist." Rourke said, "What logo?" She said, "Colton Defense Group." He kept his face where it was. He was very practiced at this. He said, "What do you know about that company?" She looked at him for a long moment, and in the look there was something he couldn't immediately categorize, not suspicion, not evasion, something closer to assessment. She was deciding something. He could see the decision happening without being able to see what it was. She said, "That's a longer conversation than I can have standing up." He said, "Then let's sit down." They sat. The restaurant around them was quieting as some diners were released, their contact information, taken, their unfinished meals abandoned, or packed up by a staff that was doing its best to manage the gap between the ordinary and whatever this was. The jazz had stopped. Nobody had thought to restart it. He said, "Tell me about the logo." She said, "My father's final mission." There was a contractor involved, C.D.G. Colton Defense Group. He mentioned them in his field notes. He marked the entry in a specific way, the way he marked things he wanted to come back to. He never got to come back to it. Rourke said, "And tonight when you saw the logo on Brett Colton's jacket?" She said, "I recognized it before I knew his name." He paused. She paused. She said, "I still don't know his name." He said, "His name is Brett Colton." He let that sit for a moment. He said, "His father founded the company." Nothing moved in her face, but he had been watching faces for 22 years, and he understood that the stillness itself was the response. He said, "I'll need you to stay in Portland for the next few days while I complete the formal investigation." "Are you able to do that?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Is there anything else you want to tell me right now?" She looked at the window. Outside, the Pearl District was doing its ordinary Friday evening business, people moving between restaurants and bars, the particular energy of a city that does not know something has just happened 3 floors below its feet. She said, "Not right now, no." He said, "All right." He closed his notebook. He said, "We'll continue this tomorrow if needed." She said, "Whenever you need." That was when the man in the plaid shirt walked over. He had been at the adjacent booth since the beginning of the night, and Rourke had noted him in the first sweep of the room, had flagged him as a potential witness, had been intending to take a statement, and been working toward it when the paramedics arrived and redirected the sequence. He stopped at a respectful distance from their table. He waited for Delia to look at him. She looked at him. He said, "I know I'm interrupting. I'll keep it short." He reached into the chest pocket of his shirt and removed a plain business card, ordinary. Just a name and a phone number. He placed it on the table in front of her. He said, "My name is Marcus Webb. I'd like to talk to you if you're willing. Not tonight, whenever you're ready." She picked up the card. She read the name once. Something moved across her face that Rourke would spend the next 3 days trying to describe accurately and never quite get there. It was not recognition in the way that recognition usually looked. It was more like the face that a person makes when a sound they have been almost hearing for a very long time suddenly resolves into something specific. She said, "Webb?" He said, "Yes." She said, "You're David Webb's brother." The man said, "Younger brother." "Yeah." Cal Rourke looked between them. He did not have enough information yet to understand what he was watching, but he had enough information to know he should not interrupt it. Delia said, "How did you know I was here?" Marcus Webb said. "I didn't. I come here on the 14th every year." He said it simply in the way of someone who has done a thing long enough that explaining it feels almost unnecessary. "This is where David and I had dinner the last time I saw him before his final deployment." He smiled briefly, a smile that had a lot of old weight in it. He said, "I didn't even see you come in. I was already at my table." The silence that followed was the kind that had too much in it to fill quickly. Delia said, "I'm sorry about your brother." He said, "They know you are." He paused. Then he said, "I know what the official report says about how it happened. I also know what David believed from his last letters. He was going to talk to someone when he got back." He looked at his hands for a moment. He said, "He didn't get the chance." Rourke said carefully, "Mr. Webb, I'm in the middle of taking a statement. Would you be willing to wait?" Marcus Webb looked at him with the patient, slightly amused expression of a man who had spent decades being patient with processes. He said, "Of course, detective. I'm not going anywhere." He went back to his table. He sat down. He did not look at his phone. Rourke looked at Delia. She was looking at the business card. Her face was still, but still in the way that water is still on top of something, moving underneath. He said, "Do you want to tell me what that was about?" She said, "He's the brother of a soldier who died in the same incident that killed my father. 12 years ago." He said, "The same incident?" She said, "The same night, the same mission." He said, "That's a coincidence." She looked at him with the gray eyes that were doing that thing. They kept doing that assessment that was somehow both warmer and more thorough than he expected from someone her age. And she said, "I stopped believing in coincidences around the same time I stopped believing that official reports were the same thing as what actually happened." Rourke sat with that for a moment, then he closed his notebook. This was a choice, and he understood it as a choice because closing the notebook changed the nature of the conversation from an official record to something else, something closer to two people deciding how much to tell each other. He said the name Colton appears in a case I've been building for 4 months. 3 women in the city, 3 incidents, none of them officially filed. Same description, same mark on the wrist. The man who grabbed you tonight matches every description I have on file. She said, that's not going to be enough. He said, no, it's probably not. She said, what would be enough? He looked at the notebook. He said, documentation, contemporaneous, from someone who was there. She looked at the wall somewhere behind his shoulder. She was working through something. He could see the architecture of it, the way she was building towards something, rather than away from it. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. A text from a colleague. The videos were already hitting platforms. The number attached to the most viewed clip was already substantial, and it had been 20 minutes. He put the phone face down on the table. He said, Delia, the videos from tonight, they're already out there. She said, I know. He said, your face is in all of them. She said, I know. He said, is that a problem for you? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her purse and removed her phone. She looked at the screen with an expression that was not surprise and was not dismay. She said, I haven't had a social media account in 12 years. I don't appear in any searchable photographs. I moved every 18 months on average. I paid cash for everything I could pay cash for and kept a clean record on everything I couldn't. She set the phone face up on the table so he could see the screen. The clip had 400,000 views. It was 19 minutes old. She said 12 years of that, gone now. She said it in the tone of someone acknowledging a weather event. Present tense. Factual. Not performing equanimity, but actually having it, which was different and rarer. And he thought harder. He said, I'm sorry. She said, don't be. I made a choice. He said, do you regret it? She looked at the adjacent table where Marcus Webb was sitting with his untouched coffee and his 40 years of quiet grief and his dead brother's name. She said, ask me again in a week. Then her phone lit up. Not a notification, a message. She looked at the screen and something changed, not on her face, which stayed exactly where it was, but in the air around her, some subtle shift in the quality of her attention that he had learned in 22 years to read as the difference between a person who was processing something and a person who had just been handed something important. She turned the phone so he could see it. The message was from a number he did not recognize. No contact name. Timestamped 2 minutes ago, which was 9:17 in the evening. It was a photograph. 2 men in full kit somewhere outdoors, the background suggesting elevation, the light suggesting late afternoon. They were standing close together with the posture of people who had shared something and knew it, not posed, not performing the photograph of a moment rather than a portrait. The man on the left was lean and had the specific stillness in his face that Delia had around the jaw and the eyes. The man on the right was broader, darker-haired, grinning in a way that suggested he smiled more readily than his companion did. On the back of the photograph, visible in the image, because whoever had taken the picture had photographed both sides, handwritten in a careful print, he knew. Now you do too. Don't waste it, Rourke said. Is that your father? She said yes, he said, and the other man? She looked at the adjacent booth. Marcus Webb was looking back at her with an expression that said he had not sent the message, but that he recognized what was in the photograph because some images stay with you for 12 years, whether you want them to or not. She said, I think that's David Webb. Rourke picked up his phone and called in a trace request on the number. He knew before he finished the call that it would come back to a prepaid device purchased with cash because that was how these things always went, but he called it in anyway because not calling it in was how things got missed. He said, someone was watching you tonight. She said, yes. He said, someone who knew your father, who knew David Webb, who waited until tonight, specifically tonight, to make contact. She said, yes. He said, why tonight? She picked up the phone and looked at the photograph again. Her father's face in the afternoon light of somewhere high and far away that had cost everything. She said quietly, not to him in particular, because before tonight I was invisible, and invisible people can't do anything. She put the phone in her purse. He watched her do it and understood that the conversation was shifting again, that she was making another decision, and that the shape of it was going to determine a great deal about what happened next. He said, Delia, I need to ask you one more question. She said, I know what you're going to ask. He said, do you have documentation on your father's mission? Anything he kept? She looked at him for a long time. The kind of look that was really a measurement calibrating something she couldn't put directly into words. Deciding whether the person across from her was the kind of person her father would have trusted. She said, I have his field notes. He said, what's in them? She said, enough to know we shouldn't be talking about this here. He said, where then? She looked around the restaurant. The remaining diners. The staff moving with the controlled urgency of people trying to restore normalcy to a space that had briefly lost it. Marcus Webb and his untouched coffee. The empty seats where Brett Colton and Seth Pryor had been loaded onto gurneys and removed from the building with the same efficiency that the restaurant would use to strip and reset their table by morning. She said, you have an office? He said, I do. She said, tomorrow morning. He said, 8 o'clock. She said, 8 o'clock. She stood up. She adjusted her dress. She picked up her purse. She walked to the adjacent booth and stopped in front of Marcus Webb, who looked up at her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time and was not entirely surprised that it had arrived in this particular form. She said the letter David mentioned in his last correspondence. Did he write it? Marcus Webb's expression moved through something complicated and arrived somewhere that was more resolved than it had been. He reached into the inside pocket of his plaid shirt and removed a plain white envelope. He said, I bring it every year, October 14th. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because this is the last place I felt like I still had a brother, and bringing it here felt like the closest I could get to giving it to him. He held it out. He said, but I think it was always meant for you. I just had to wait until the right person showed up to receive it. The envelope was sealed. It had yellowed slightly at the edges. He held it out to her. She took it. She said, thank you. He said, David would have wanted you to have it a long time ago. He looked at her steadily. He said, I just had to be sure you were the right person. She said, and now you are. He said, I watched you try everything else first. He picked up his coffee cup finally and held it in both hands. He said, that's how I knew. She put the envelope in her purse. She walked through the dining room without hurrying past the remaining diners and the staff and the spot on the floor where the wine glass had shattered and been swept up and was now only a faint discoloration in the wood, past the table where she had sat with 2 menus and 2 glasses of water and 12 years of a quiet dinner she had been trying to have through the front door of Harlow and Reed and into the Portland night. Cal Rourke sat at the table where she had been sitting and looked at his notebook and thought about 12 years and field notes carried in the lining of a belt and a tattoo on the inside of a wrist and a company name that kept appearing in places it should not have been. Then he picked up his phone and called downtown and asked for the full corporate filings on Colton Defense Group going back 15 years. He had a feeling he was going to be in the office early. Part 3. What she carries home. The hotel room was on the 7th floor and the window faced west, and at 11:40 in the evening, the city was doing what cities do, holding its own light against the dark, indifferent to the things that had just happened at a restaurant on Northwest 13th Avenue, indifferent to the 3 men who were being processed through the emergency intake at Providence Medical Center, indifferent to a detective sitting in his car in the parking structure across the street on the phone with the corporate filings office, asking questions that would not be answered until morning. Delia Voss sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the envelope in her hands. It was not heavy, a single sheet of paper, maybe 2. The kind of envelope that a person buys at a drugstore without thinking about it, the kind that gets used for birthday cards and utility payments and things that are not supposed to matter. The yellowing at the edges was the yellowing of 12 years of a thing that had been held and set down and held again waiting. She did not open it immediately. She set it on the nightstand and looked at it for a while. Then she took a shower and changed out of the green dress and hung the dress on the back of the door because even now there was a part of her that was her father's daughter in the specific way of someone who had been taught that the care of equipment is not a small thing, that how you treat your gear says something about how you treat everything else. She made a cup of coffee from the machine on the counter. She sat in the chair by the window. She opened the envelope. David Webb had written the letter in 2 sessions. You could tell because the handwriting changed partway through the second paragraph, the letters tightening in the way that happens when a person returns to something after time has passed and they have decided it is more urgent than they initially believed. He had dated it 3 days before he died. He wrote to Ray Voss, not to Delia, because he had not known about Delia specifically, or rather he had known the way soldiers know about each other's families, in the general sense of knowing there was a daughter or a wife at home somewhere that the war was supposed to be keeping safe. He wrote to Ray Voss because Ray Voss was the person he trusted most in the specific situation he was trying to describe. He wrote, I know what I saw in the manifest. I know what came off the truck didn't match what the paperwork said. I know you know too because you were standing 3 feet from me and you have the same eyes I have for this kind of thing. And neither of us said anything because we were 20 hours from the op and there was no time and nothing to do about it right then. But I'm writing this down because I think someone should have it in writing from someone who was there in case the things I'm worried about turn out to be the things I should be worried about. He wrote the contractor was CDG. I've seen their equipment before and it was fine. This time something was different. I can't tell you exactly what because I'm not an engineer, but I know the difference between gear that will hold and gear that is going to fail. And I knew it standing there on that tarmac and I said nothing. And that is going to stay with me however this turns out. He wrote, if something happens on this op and you're reading this, which means Marcus found a way to get it to you, I need you to know that it wasn't the plan or the personnel or the men. It was the equipment. And whoever signed off on that equipment knew what they were signing. He wrote, if something happens to both of us and you can't read this, I hope it ends up in the right hands eventually. I hope whoever is holding it knows what to do with it. Then the handwriting changed. The second session was shorter, 4 sentences. He wrote, I don't know why I'm adding this. Maybe because it's the third day and I keep thinking about it and I need to say it somewhere even if nobody reads it. Your daughter is going to be good at this if you let her. Don't let her be only this. He had signed it with his first name and a date. Delia read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and held the envelope in both hands and sat with the window and the city light and the particular quality of silence that follows the receipt of something you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting for it. Her father had known about the equipment. She had understood this in the way that you know things you cannot prove for 12 years. She had carried the field notes in the lining of her bag for 12 years because some part of her understood that the notes were evidence of something without being able to say exactly what or exactly for whom. She had kept them the way her father had taught her to keep important things close, quiet, unannounced. She picked up her phone. She looked at the number of an incoming call she had missed while she was in the shower. She did not recognize it, but she recognized the area code, which was the area code for a specific part of Virginia that housed, among other things, a number of government facilities and the retirement communities of people who had spent their careers in those facilities. She did not call back tonight. She set the phone on the nightstand beside the envelope. She lay down on top of the covers with her shoes on, which was something her mother had always found incomprehensible and which was something her father had always done, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about what David Webb had written. Don't let her be only this. She thought, Dad, I've been trying. She thought, I think I might be done trying to be less. She was asleep before midnight. She was at the precinct at 7:58. Rourke was already there. He was wearing the particular expression of someone who had not gone home between the end of one day and the beginning of another, the slight compression around the eyes, the coffee cup that was clearly not the first. He had a folder open on his desk and he closed it when she came in and gestured to the chair across from him, which was the standard government-issue chair of every official space she had ever sat in, and she sat in it with the ease of someone for whom official spaces had never been intimidating. He said, I got 3 hours of sleep and 17 pages of corporate filings. Good morning, she said. What did you find? He turned the folder around and pushed it across the desk to her. She opened it. She read methodically, not quickly, not with the urgency of someone hoping to find a specific thing, but with the comprehensive attention of someone who understood that the important detail might be anywhere in the stack. Colton Defense Group had been incorporated 23 years ago. The founding documents listed 2 principals, Gerard Colton, who had spent 11 years in military procurement before transitioning to the private sector, and a business partner who had died 9 years ago, and whose estate held a minority stake through a subsidiary. CDG had grown steadily through a series of DoD contracts, each one leading to the next. The ordinary accumulation of a company that understood how the procurement process worked because one of its founders had spent a decade on the other side of it. Brett Colton had joined the company's board at age 26. His listed qualifications were a business degree from a state university, 2 years in sales, and a last name. She found what she was looking for on page 11. It was a contract addendum, October 12 years ago. A modification to an existing equipment delivery agreement changing the specifications of a particular component in a way that required a technical waiver. The waiver had been filed and approved on the same day. The approval signature belonged to Gerard Colton. The contract covered equipment delivered to a Special Forces unit. The unit number was redacted in the public filing, but the base of origin was not. Fort Bragg, October. She closed the folder. She reached into her bag and found the inner lining with her fingers, the hidden seam that she had reinforced twice over 12 years because it mattered that the seam held. She worked the small compartment open and removed a flat metal case the size of a playing card. Inside the case was a field notes journal worn to the color of old leather, and behind it, slotted into the back cover, a small data card in a plastic sleeve. She set the journal on the desk. She set the data card beside it. She said the journal is handwritten. The card has photographs of every page timestamped and verified 12 years ago by a notary in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I did it 3 weeks after the flag. I didn't know why at the time. My father taught me that documentation mattered, and I couldn't think of anything else to do with my hands. Rourke looked at the journal and the card and then looked at her. She said, page 41. He lists the CDG delivery. He describes the specific component. He uses a term I didn't understand when I was 12 and looked up when I was 16 and understood then why he had underlined it. Rourke picked up the journal with both hands. He handled it the way she had handled the envelope the night before, with the particular care that people apply to objects that have been waiting longer than they should have had to. He said, Delia, this changes things. She said, I know. He said, this is going to require a federal referral. What's in this journal, combined with what I have on the CDG contractor history and what happened last night with Brett Colton, this is not a Portland PD case anymore. She said, I understand. He said, once I make that referral, I can't control the timeline or the process. These things take time, the kind of time that is difficult to measure in any unit that feels proportionate to what you've been carrying. She said, Detective, I've been carrying it for 12 years. I think I can manage the timeline. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. Not an official nod, not a procedure nod. Something quieter than that, the nod of someone who has just been handed something real and knows it. He reached for his phone. 3 weeks passed. They passed the way the weeks after consequential things pass, which is to say they passed both slowly in the hours and with disorienting speed in retrospect each day, containing more than the days before it had contained, and yet somehow adding up to only 3 weeks when you look back. The video had 40 million views by the end of the first week. The comment section had become something she did not look at directly, but that other people described to her because people had begun to describe things to her in ways they had not before, calling numbers she had not published and sending messages to accounts she had not created. Veterans mostly, women in their 30s and 40s and 50s who had served in capacities that were not acknowledged in the ways that capacities involving rifles and front lines were acknowledged. Men who wrote in the specific unadorned register of people who had learned to communicate in environments where economy of language was a survival skill. The top comment, the one that gathered underneath it, more agreement than any other, read, this is why you treat everyone with respect. You never know who you're sitting next to. She thought her father would have found that quietly accurate. She stayed in Portland. She had not originally planned to. She had a room she was renting month to month in a building off Burnside, paid in advance, the kind of arrangement that had always served her well, and she had not had a reason to extend it, but now she had a reason. She extended it. She bought a few more things for the room. A second lamp, a plant which was new for her. Something about having to water it every day felt important in a way she did not immediately analyze. She called her mother on a Sunday evening. Vivian Voss answered on the second ring the way she always did, because she had always treated Delia's Sunday calls with the kind of priority that she applied quietly to everything that mattered. Delia said, Mom, I need to tell you something. Vivian said, I know, sweetheart. I've seen the video. Delia said, I broke my promise. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, which one? Delia said, Dad's. I used what he taught me. Vivian said, were you hurt? Delia said, no. Vivian said, was anyone innocent hurt? Delia said, no. Vivian said, then I think your father's promise was kept in the way he intended it. She paused. She said, he also taught you judgment, Delia. That was part of the same lesson. Delia sat with that for a while. Then she said, I gave his field notes to a detective. There's a federal investigation now. Vivian was quiet in the particular way that meant she was absorbing something large without making it smaller to fit the space available. She said, is it going to come to anything? Delia said, I think so. I think it already is. Vivian said, good. She said it simply, without performance, the way she said things she had believed for a long time and no longer needed to argue for. Then she said, are you okay? Delia said, I'm okay, Mom. I kept my promise. Just not the way either of us expected. The federal referral had moved faster than Rourke predicted, which he told her on a Tuesday in his office, with an expression that was equal parts surprised and relieved. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division had already had a file open on Colton Defense Group for reasons connected to a separate investigation that had been running in parallel for 18 months. The field notes and the data card had provided something they had been unable to establish from their existing documentation, which was the specific mechanism, what had been changed when it had been changed, and who had been present to observe it. The corporate filings that had previously been difficult to interpret now arranged themselves into a legible pattern. Gerard Colton was 71 years old and had spent the last several years managing the company from a residential address in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was not a well-known man. He had spent his entire career in proximity to well-known things in the margins of official processes, signing documents that were reviewed by people who trusted that someone else had verified the technical specifications. He had signed the waiver. He had signed it quickly on the same day it was filed because the timeline of the delivery was already compressed, and because the component in question was not the kind of thing that a procurement specialist typically reviewed personally, the kind of thing that existed in the middle of a chain of delegation where everyone assumed someone below them had checked it and no one had. Whether he had known precisely what he was signing was the question the investigation would spend the next several months answering. Whether it mattered in the way that mattered to Delia was a different question entirely, and one that did not have a legal filing attached to it. Brett Colton was charged with assault, unlawful restraint, and 3 counts of harassment connected to the women whose complaints Rourke had been unable to move forward for 4 months. The restaurant footage, the witness statements from 41 diners and 3 women who were now willing to come forward because something about watching a young woman in a green dress refuse to back down had made the calculus feel different than it had before. The charges were filed on a Thursday. He made bail Friday and sat in his father's house in Lake Oswego and described his injuries to people who had not asked. His nose bent left. Whenever anyone mentioned it, he touched it reflexively with 2 fingers. He never approached another woman without her explicit invitation again. Not because he had become a different person. Because he had learned at considerable cost that the world contained people he could not read on sight, and that the cost of being wrong about one of them had been larger than he had accounted for. Seth Pryor settled quietly. Danny Fitch completed a diversion program and relocated to Boise and took a position in logistics and did not, as far as anyone could determine, associate with Brett Colton again. Marcus Webb called her twice that month, once to tell her that David's case had been formally reopened as part of the expanded investigation, once to say nothing much in particular, really just that he had been thinking about something David had written in the letter, the part about Ray Voss's daughter being good at things if she was allowed to be, and that he wanted her to know he thought David had been right about that. She said he was a good judge of people. Marcus said the best I ever knew. He got it from your father, I think. They were the same that way. She said, yeah. He said it with the weight of something he had been carrying for 12 years that had not disappeared but had settled differently, the way weight settles when it finally arrives at the place it was always headed. He said, I'm glad I was at that restaurant. She said, me too. She was sitting in a coffee shop on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks and 2 days after the night at Harlow and Reed, when the man came in. He was in his early 60s, lean through the frame, with the particular way of moving that she recognized before she identified it, consciously the economy of motion that belongs to people who have spent years in environments where how you moved was not aesthetic but functional. He was wearing civilian clothes that fit him the way civilian clothes always fit certain people slightly wrong at the shoulders, as though the body underneath had been shaped by other requirements for too long. He ordered coffee at the counter. He scanned the room in the first 4 seconds the way she scanned rooms, the way her father had scanned rooms. His eyes found hers and he stopped. Not the stop of surprise. The stop of someone who has located a thing they have been moving toward for a long time and is making a final decision about whether to close the remaining distance. He carried his coffee to her table. He stood beside it. He said, you look like your father. She said, I know. He said, my name is Holt Greer. I was a warrant officer. I was assigned to your father's unit. I was the 4th man on the team that night. She had known this was coming in the vague way that you know the things that are assembling themselves towards you when you cannot yet see the final shape. The missed call from the Virginia area code, the photograph sent from the prepaid device, the specific knowledge demonstrated in the message, the intimacy of it, the weight of someone who had been watching from a distance long enough to know exactly when the distance had to close. She said, sit down. He sat. He set his coffee cup on the table and held it with both hands and looked at it for a moment, the hands of a man who had spent decades being competent at things and was now sitting across from the daughter of the man his silence had failed to protect. The weight of that sat visibly on him Not in any theatrical way, but in the way that real weight sits on people who are not performing remorse, but actually carrying it. He said, I want to explain why I waited, not as an excuse. As context, she said, all right. He said, when it happened, I was the only one who came out. Your father and David Webb were gone. The investigation started before I was even out of the field hospital. I was debriefed 4 times in 6 weeks. I was told very clearly that the official report was the official report and that the things I had observed about the equipment were not going to be part of it because the investigation had concluded the failure was environmental rather than material. He looked up at her. He said, I knew that conclusion was wrong. I had been standing next to your father on that tarmac. I saw the same manifest he saw. She said, why didn't you fight it? He set the coffee cup down. He said, I had a family, 2 kids, retirement 18 months out. He said it without apology, but also without deflection, in the tone of someone who had made a decision he understood the full weight of and had been living inside that weight ever since. He said, I told myself I would come back to it. When the kids were through college, when I was clear of the service, when there was more distance. He paused. He said, there's never more distance. You just tell yourself there is. She said, why now? He said, because you did what I couldn't. He looked at her directly. No performance in it, the look of someone who had been rehearsing an honest thing for a long time and was finally saying it to the right person. He said, I watched that video, not because of what you did to those men in 17 seconds, because of what you did in the minutes before that. Every attempt to de-escalate, every verbal effort, every second of trying every available option first. He stopped. He collected something. He said, your father operated the same way. Exhaust every other option. Be the most reluctant person in the room to use force. And when there is absolutely no other way left, be precise and be done. She did not say anything. He said, I've been watching you from a distance for 12 years, not closely, just enough to know you were okay. When your father died, I thought about reaching out and then decided against it because I was afraid of what reaching out would mean, what it would pull you into. He said, I kept the photograph because I wanted one true thing about that mission. One thing that wasn't the official version. She said, what changed the night at the restaurant? He said 2 things. He ticked them off with quiet precision. First, you weren't invisible anymore. The video changed that. Reaching out couldn't make you more exposed than you already were. He paused. He said, and second, Brett Colton. When I saw his face in the news coverage the next morning, I recognized him. He said it with the specific flatness of someone stating a fact that has been a long time in the stating. He said he was at the facility the night of the mission, not in any official capacity. He was 26, maybe 27 already on the company board in name, if not in function. His father had brought him along because his father believed in the kind of education that happens when you watch the mechanics of something up close. He was old enough to understand what he was seeing. He stood at the back of the room when the equipment was signed over and said nothing. And 12 years later, he walked into a restaurant on Northwest 13th Avenue and grabbed a woman's wrist. The coffee shop was doing its ordinary morning business around them. Someone ordered something at the counter. A child was asking about a pastry in the display case. An older man at the window table was reading a physical newspaper, which had become rare enough to notice. She said, does Roark know this? He said, he will. I have a meeting with FBI this afternoon. I called them yesterday morning. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small envelope, tan-colored, recently printed, and placed it on the table. He said, that's my contact information and a summary of what I'm submitting. I wanted you to have it before I walked into that building. She looked at the envelope without picking it up. She said you should have come forward 12 years ago. He said yes. She said my father's daughter grew up without him. He said I know. She said David Webb's brother spent 12 years not knowing what actually happened to his brother. He said I know. He did not try to explain it again. He had already explained it once, and he understood that explaining it a second time was not what this moment required. Some things could only be acknowledged, not resolved. She picked up the envelope. She said, thank you for coming forward now. He looked at her with an expression that was not relief, because relief implied the weight had lifted, and she could see from the way he held himself that it had not and would not completely. He said, your father was the best operator I ever served with. He was also the best person. Those 2 things are not usually the same. She said, no, they're not. He finished his coffee. He stood. He put on his jacket with the slightly wrong fit at the shoulders. He said, I hope this helps. He said it without flourish, without the performed humility of someone trying to seem smaller than they were. Just a statement of hope from a man who had arrived late and understood exactly how late he had arrived. He left. She sat with the envelope and the remains of her coffee and the ordinary noise of the morning, and thought about 12 years measured in different currencies. The currency of a promise kept. The currency of a journal carried in a lining. The currency of a woman with gray eyes who had learned to read rooms from a man who had been exceptional at it, who had sat in a booth at a restaurant on the anniversary of her father's death and tried to have a quiet dinner and had been handed instead something she had not expected and had not asked for, and that was going to cost her more than the dinner had been worth. She thought it was always going to end up here. He knew that. He knew it when he taught me. He was just trying to give me time to be something other than this first. She thought I had 12 years. That's more than some people get. The scholarship was announced 6 weeks after that Wednesday morning. It appeared in the charitable filings of a new foundation with a simple name. The mission statement was 3 sentences. The first described the purpose supporting women pursuing careers in security, defense, and public service who demonstrated both capability and character. The second named the scholarship the Voss Webb Valor Grant. The third gave credit for the founding to 2 families without specifying which individuals within those families had made the initial contributions. Delia did not give interviews. She did not post any statement. When reporters called the number listed in the foundation's public contact information, they reached a voicemail that explained the mission and provided an email address for applications. The applications in the first month numbered in the hundreds. Second Watch opened on a Thursday morning in February, in a rented space in Northeast Portland with good parking and a coat rack by the door, and a weekly schedule on the wall that ran 6 days. The sign outside was modest black letters on white, the name and a phone number. No photograph of the instructor. No biography on the website she had built herself over 2 evenings in the room with the plant she was still keeping alive, which had surprised her. The first class had 11 women. By the end of the second month, there were waiting lists for 3 of the 6 weekly sessions. Rourke's wife signed up in the 3rd week and came every Thursday at noon and said nothing about it to anyone at the precinct because she understood instinctively that the connection was not hers to announce. She came and she learned, and on one occasion when the class had ended and the other women had gathered their things and gone, she said to Delia, "He talks about you, Rourke. He never talks about cases. He talks about this one." Delia said, "What does he say?" She said, "He says you're the most prepared, unprepared person he's ever met." She delivered it with the smile of someone passing on something exactly as it was given to her. "He means it as a compliment." Delia considered this for a moment. She said, "Tell him." "That's about right." One evening in late March, a student stayed after class. She was 22 years old and small, smaller even than Delia, and she had come every week for a month with the specific quality of attention that Delia recognized as the attention of someone who was not there for exercise or general self-improvement, but who was working through something specific, something that had already happened and that she was trying to build language and capability around. She said, "Can I ask you something?" Delia said. "Yes," she said. "How do you stay calm when it's actually happening? When everything is going wrong and there's no time to think? How do you not freeze?" Delia sat on the edge of the mat. The studio was quiet in the way it was always quiet after class, the quality of a space that had recently held concentrated effort and was settling. She said, "You practice until the calm is the thing you know, and the panic is the thing that's new." She paused. She said, "But that's the technical answer. The real answer is that you find the thing you're doing it for, not the abstract thing, not protecting people in general or doing the right thing in general. The specific thing, the specific person you would not let be hurt if you could stop it. You hold that in front of you and you let everything else run in the background." The student said, "What's yours?" Delia looked at the wall for a moment. Outside, the March rain was doing what Portland rain does not. Dramatic, just present the kind of steady and unhurried rain that settles in for the long conversation. She said, "My father taught me something, and I spent a long time trying to understand what he actually meant by it." She said it to the middle distance, not performing the memory, but locating it. He said, "You are not a weapon. You are my daughter. Act like it." She said, "For a long time, I thought that meant I wasn't supposed to use what he taught me, but that's not what he meant." She looked at the student. She said, "He meant that the skill is not the point. Who you are when you use it is the point. Any weapon can be aimed. The question is what you're aiming it toward and what you're willing to cost yourself to get there and who you remain on the other side of it." The student was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has just heard something they needed and are going to need time to fully understand. Delia stood up. She straightened her sleeves. She picked up her bag and settled the strap over her shoulder. Old habit, the 2 o'clock position, the angle for a clean and easy reach. She said, "Same time Thursday." She went to the memorial wall at Fort Lewis in April on a morning when the weather was genuinely undecided. The last of winter not quite gone, the first of spring not quite arrived. The wall held the names of hundreds of men and women in the particular permanence of granite, the kind that outlasts news cycles and official reports and investigations and scholarship announcements and waiting lists for Tuesday morning self-defense classes. She found his name with her fingers. She had done this before on the morning of October 14th, 12 years of days compressed into a single morning drive up from Portland. She had stood here then in the before, the version of herself who was still carrying something without knowing where it was going. She stood here now in the after, and the after was quieter than she had expected and more ordinary, and she understood that ordinary was not the diminishment she had always assumed it to be, but was in fact the thing that came after you have done what needed doing. She pressed her palm flat against the granite. The stone was cold, in the way that stone is always cold, unhurried, indifferent, in a way that was not unkind. She said quietly, "Not for anyone around her that kept your promise, Dad. The second one, the harder one." She paused. She said, "I'm your daughter." She stood there while the morning light moved across the wall at the low angle of early April, when the sun is still climbing back to where it belongs, after the long winter, still in the process of returning, not all the way there yet. A man came to stand a few feet away. Older, maybe 70, veteran, in the way that some men are veteran, the way some buildings are stone, not stated, not decorated, just the thing they are made of, present in every line of how they hold themselves. He found a name and stood with it the way you stand with names on walls, in the particular silence that is the correct language for what walls like this are built to hold. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. They stood together in the company of people who are each alone with something large and who understand, without needing to discuss it, that this is sometimes the best company there is. The light moved. She took her hand from the stone. She put her bag over her shoulder. She walked back to her car through the April morning past the other names and the other visitors, in the flag at the far end of the path, moving in the light wind, and she thought about a plant on a windowsill in Northeast Portland and a class on Thursday, and a student who had asked the right question, and a detective who was still working, and a man named Marcus Webb who called on Sundays now, and an older man named Holt Greer, who had finally walked into a federal building and said the thing he should have said 12 years ago, and who was carrying that differently now, better and worse, at the same time the way you carry something when it is finally where it belongs instead of where it has been. She started the car. She drove south.